Jeremiah, whom was visiting his girlfriend, who lives about an hour away from Bellevue, in a small town called Stillwater, just east of Seattle. It was around 3 in the morning on Saturday when they had both decided to step out on her porch and smoke a cigarette. They were standing in front of her house, just chit-chatting away, and of course there are more woods along the sidewalk along the street and across from an open field around her house. The houses around are spaced apart with large yards between them, and across from them was also an empty field with scattered trees throughout, making it feel a lot more full. They talked about how cold it was, and she had mentioned to Jeremiah that she had this weird feeling, and that's when they began hearing a strange noise. At first, Jeremiah didn't hear it, but after a few seconds, he then heard it, and had listened to this strange, almost moaning, groaning sound coming from the tree line off behind the house in the distance. This time, though, he knows for sure that his girlfriend had heard it too, because the way she had looked at him and the expression she wore on her face was simply terrifying. Jeremiah turned to look where she was looking at the woodline, and although he did not see anything, he heard yet another strange sound coming from the woods the second he looked, and it was unlike anything they had ever heard before, and it really scared both of them. Now his girlfriend, she's lived out here for probably about 6 or so years now and has never heard anything like this. And so he's asking her what it could be, and they both have no idea. So they're standing there for a few moments trying to figure out what was this noise and what animal could possibly be making it. Jeremiah insisted that they should both go inside because whatever it was seemed to be getting closer and closer. However, before going inside, Jeremiah just happened to have his little Zoom handheld recorder with him that he had brought, and he had recorded probably about 30 or so seconds of it, the same clip you guys just heard at the beginning of this episode. Whatever it was in the background was setting off the dogs, and they would bark every time this thing would make a roar or a grunt or a groan, and at random times would seem to come closer to the house and then farther away. And this went on till about 5 or 6 in the morning, according to Jeremiah and his girlfriend. And at times, because they were so terrified being locked in the house, they were looking outside, and Jeremiah's girlfriend could have sworn that she had seen strange lights in the woods and had heard what sounded like people talking or making noise, but could not at all make out what they were saying. And so Jeremiah began asking her what it is that she had heard and who was out there. But she couldn't exactly give a description because it was hard to tell. Jeremiah and his girlfriend felt completely on edge, like they could hear something huge coming towards the house in the trees near the back porch. What's a little unsettling is that for Jeremiah's girlfriend, her back porch is only roughly 30 or so feet away from the thick timber, as a reference point. A pretty unnerving experience in this case. Jeremiah assumed that this could just be a large black bear, but his girlfriend quickly dismissed the notion that bears don't make this kind of sound, and neither are sure what this could be, if anything. And since this recording, they have both been actively trying to find out what the source of this noise was and what animal was making it. Jeremiah ends his letter with saying that he doesn't know what lives out in the woods that makes that kind of noise, but his girlfriend and him both agree that it reminded them of a giant reptile or something. At least that's how he said it sounded that night when he was out there capturing the sounds. All of the backyard woods, if you go far enough back, you actually go into the bog reserve. So it's just thick timber and woods for miles on, right against the national forest. So who knows what's living in it? Even just telling this story brings back those memories and terrifies both Jeremiah and his girlfriend. Which really makes me wonder personally, what did he capture on that recording that night? Was it something strange and mysterious, perhaps supernatural, or was this simply just a black bear or maybe a fox, and maybe just a misidentification? I'll let you guys be the judge. On December 22nd, 2014, a James Thomas Griffin had disappeared, and unfortunately, on January 25th, 2015, a body had been found along Boulder Creek hiking trail in the Olympic National Park in Washington state. James's story is very similar to many other hikers and campers who just mysteriously go missing in the national parks. James, for example, was just planning to innocently go hiking in the Olympic National Park in Washington state just before Christmas in 2014. He was last seen by other hikers at the Olympic Hot Springs right around 4 p.m. on that same day on the 22nd. But it wouldn't be until December 24th on Christmas Eve that he would actually be reported as missing when he failed to show up to a Christmas Eve dinner that he had planned with some friends a while back. Fast forward to the 25th, or Christmas Day, there was no sign of James, but his backpack had shown up randomly. And on Sunday, January 25th, a whole 30 days later, James's body was finally recovered nearly 1,000 vertical feet above the trail. This, of course, begs for questioning. How did this happen? How did his body get up here? And what happened? James already was single, he was 60 years old, he was retired, and he lived alone, so he was kind of more of a lone wolf. According to friends and family, he was an avid hiker and lover of the outdoors, but he wasn't a young gun like a 20-year-old hiker would be. But because of his frequent visitations at the park, he knew the park and the trails very well. What's interesting, when James's day pack was found on Christmas Day, it was roughly about a half mile away from the trailhead of the Boulder Creek hiking trail in the Olympic Peninsula's Elwha Valley, and about 50 or so feet off the trail itself. The pack was leaning against a log, looking like items had somehow been removed and contained his equipment, like his stove, his water, his food. There was a camera in there, things to start fires, and other provisions. It looked like somebody had been pulling stuff out, assuming it was James, because there was an actual towel laying on a nearby log, and a Coke can set on top, and a plastic coffee mug as well. And there's even an unfinished bag of prepared freeze-dried food that had been resealed. But yet, there was no signs of a struggle in the area at all, and the camera only contained an image of a nearby waterfall. So he had been walking around, probably taking nature photography and just enjoying himself. So how does that explain his mysterious disappearance? Well, despite a week-long search with no clues popping up until a month later, when on January 25th, 2015, James's body was finally recovered, about a third of a mile away and nearly 1,000 vertical feet above the trail. What's strange is, according to park officials, it appeared that Griffin had stepped off the trail to prepare a snack, but at some point became disorientated and could not find the trail again. A spokesperson by the name of Barb Maines spoke out and said this: "There's nothing to suggest anything other than someone who lost his location and could not find his backpack again, where he stepped off the trail and became lost and disorientated. As to why he climbed the steep hill where his body was found, Maines suggested, if it's dark and you can't see anything, it's easier to walk uphill. You are more in control." Now, of course, this is just speculation, but could this just be the county trying to write off any possible correlation between this and abductions or any of the many, many popular missing 411 cases that have strange results surrounding the missing body found? An autopsy report was performed by county pathologist Eric Kiesel, and he indicated that James had died from hypothermia, much the same way many missing 411 victims do when they are found miles away from their body or a short distance away but up a high vertical cliff wall, or something similar to how Robert died. Now, personally, if he had a leg injury as bad as he did, it doesn't make sense that he would randomly try to climb a 1,000-foot steep hill unless he was either scared or something had chased him up. But either way, personally, I find it very odd. And apparently, I'm not the only one that thinks so, because his brother even said when interviewed that the autopsy result was really odd. And he quoted that it's just one of those things that happened and nobody will ever know what the reasons were for him going up the hill. So apparently I'm not alone in my presumption that something strange had happened, and this wasn't just a normal case of him wandering up a 1,000-foot hill with a leg injury and then just managed to die. That doesn't make sense, especially if he's already an intelligent, experienced, and avid hiker, which leads us to the question, what happened to James Griffin? Why did he leave his food pack just off the trail and climb 1,000 feet up a steep hillside? You have to remember that he wasn't just climbing 1,000 feet hillside, it was also pitch black. And for him, it would have been incredibly difficult. So we can only presume that something had spooked him or scared him or taken him. But what? What resides in the Olympic National Park that has those kinds of powers? Of course, the common theory with many investigators is that on his way back to his car, he had somehow got disorientated and got lost in the dark. But personally, I'm not buying it. Between all the national park missing persons cases, there's just too many strange things going on. And I'm sure any of you out there watching this who know anything about the strange missing persons cases would probably agree when you look at the critical details of this case. The autopsy later confirmed that there were no substances, drugs, or alcohol involved, and ultimately, James is just written off as another mysterious death in the Olympic National Park. What do you think? I recently received an email from a man who calls himself Craig, and he has a true story that occurred in Washington State on 1993 and Christmas Eve on Fire Trail Road. Now, there are 3 parts to this story, but he just wanted to stick to the actual events in the interest of time. It was a snowy Christmas Eve this year, and their house was full of Christmas spirit. His sisters and his mom and his dad were getting ready to visit and have dinner with some local friends in Marysville, Washington. At the time, they had lived in Everett, Washington. And Craig was watching a rather strange Christmas cartoon where a UFO had come down to interact with humans on Christmas Day. And Craig can still remember the song from the show. In retrospect, he believes that these visitors were preparing him for what was to come. Now, on their way back from Smoky Point and a prosperous dinner, the snow was really coming down hard, and Craig and his family decided to take a back road on native land called Fire Trail Road. There were lots of trees and very few lights and no other traffic as it was Christmas Eve and right around 10 p.m. As they're driving, from the back seat, Craig had yelled with surprise to his dad at the sight of a giant white owl with brilliant yellow eyes in a tree. His dad noticed the owl and instantly pulled over to get a better look because it was so strange. Craig's dad and him exited the vehicle and gazed in awe when it spread its enormous wings and flew away. And that's when Craig and his father saw it. A gigantic, several football fields length wide, multicolored disc descended directly above their vehicle at less than 100 feet. It was glorious and spinning slowly and completely silent. In fact, Craig claims it had some sort of sound dampening capabilities because he could not hear him and his father speak, or their mother, who was yelling. They could not listen to her. Craig's mother was in total panic at the sight of this above their car and was screaming at Craig and his father to get back in the car now. She was a mess. And Craig can remember the cartoon not taking his eyes from the craft because of how quickly it would move when it left. And after what seemed like a few moments, it departed. And Craig was correct. He has never seen anything move so fast in his entire life. It shot up so freakishly quickly. It was almost like a cartoon. The speed at which it moved and punched a large hole in the clouds as it left utterly silent. When it departed, Craig could suddenly hear his mother screaming and all other sounds around him returned. It was the most fantastic experience besides his own child's birth. Now in 2020, Craig would lose his father to cancer. It was a peaceful death, and before he had passed, he discussed that incident that happened so many years ago, because nobody in Craig's family has ever forgotten it. There was missing time, and they drove home safe, and that night, there was yet another visit. The entities that visited them were these tall, Nordic-looking white beings. They were benevolent and compelling. Angelic was the word that comes to mind. He remembers being very upset afterward that they didn't take him with them. Later on, Craig had a visit from one of these male entities, which stood at roughly 10 feet, and he had a kind look on his face and reassured Craig with a smile without saying anything that he would see them again. And Craig swears with every word that is written it is 100% true, and he wouldn't change that experience for the world, as it made him look at the world in a different light and never have to question if there are other entities around them. With Washington State being a paranormal hotspot in the country, I wouldn't be surprised at all if Craig's story is in fact true. January 20th of 1992, a Stefan Bissert had disappeared near the Sol Duck Hot Springs, an Olympic National Park in Washington State. Stefan, who was an exchange student from Germany, was actually studying down in Oregon State University, and a very intelligent kid. He and another German student were hiking on January 20th, 1992 in the Sol Duck area, which is on the west side of the Olympic National Park. They had planned to hike to Deer Lake, which was only roughly 4 miles southwest of the current location. Stefan and his hiking friend separated for some reason, and Bissert tried to hike out 23 miles to the Hoh River trailhead. When he had failed to arrive, of course, his friend had reported him missing on January 21st. He was not dressed or equipped to camp overnight in the snow, wearing only jeans and a shirt and a simple windbreaker. He only carried a day pack with him, which only contained a few provisions like a few pieces of fruit, or some other small bits of miscellaneous food, but he had no hat, gloves, or equipment for overnight camping. That route would have taken Stefan into the heart of the Olympic high country and into a winter storm area that had hit that area all week long. Once a full-on search pursued, it included park rangers, mountaineer rescue teams with dogs and helicopters, even volunteer searchers, including members of the Kitsap-based Olympic Mountain Rescue, were then deployed in search for Stefan. And after 5 days of very intensive searching, they failed to turn up any clues of the missing hiker, and the search was ultimately called off. Search and rescue teams had contended with rain, sleet, cold, snow, and other extreme dangers of avalanches. And unfortunately, it is very likely that Stefan succumbed to the cold, bitter winter of Washington and was never found. Vanessa decided to share a compilation of experiences dating through the years 1988 to 2009. Feelings of being watched, wildlife silenced, tree breaks, strong smells, numerous late-night vocalizations, rock knocking, and things being thrown near her tent, and an actual daytime sighting. Vanessa's husband and her have been camping and caving in the Trout Lake, Washington area for about 20 years now, and are both very experienced in the outdoors, particularly in the Northwest. They've gone primarily to this area for caving, or for those of you who take it more seriously, spelunking, for many years. The first encounter with something unusual was right around 1988 to 89. On a caving trip in this area as they had penetrated the forest, heading toward Mount Adams through some old clear cut to visit a very well familiar cave. Bird song of various types is always present, but as they had made their way toward the tree line, the bird song and even insect noise seemed to cease. Vanessa looked up with no indication of foul weather or damp wind, indicating rain. Their group, which she thinks at the time was about 7 or 8 of them, were all familiar with deep woods, and a couple of people noted that this behavior was strange, the noises falling silent and having no signs of foul weather coming. They all stopped in their tracks, even though nobody had heard anything like a large predator being nearby. Everybody was looking around, all listening very intently. But something seemed wrong. And then Vanessa had a powerful sense of being watched from further in, not too far away, but she did not tell anybody else. She did not want to stir panic. She felt the others sensed this as well, and they all pushed quickly on to get to the cave, sticking close to one another. This happened on several caving trips over the years, but not in this exact location. The proximity, however, was pretty close, all within about a 5-mile radius. And yet, there was another time, around 2002. Vanessa's partner and her had dispersed camping alone, right next to a very seldom used forest road in the same area, east of the main forest road. They got out on their vehicle to begin setting up camp, and as they had done several other times in the same area, and noticed an almost vomit-inducing stench. It was not the smell of something dead, it was like a combination of sun-baked garbage and feces. It was decided that perhaps some local had driven back here and maybe dumped their trash, but then about 5 minutes later, the smell just simply went away. Vanessa has no idea about the smells encountered by others at this time, so they simply blew it off. They walked around, sniffing around the whole area just a little, and there was nothing. So they decided to camp there anyway, thinking maybe something just must have been carried by the wind, but it was still strange how strong and stink it was. They've also heard some late-night sounds when camped at Peterson Prairie many times. Some dismissed them like coyotes, but these sounds were whoops, with several animals at once. And Vanessa very clearly remembers silently filing through all the animal sounds in her head that she'd ever heard, like elk, coyote, deer, cougar, wolves, marmots, bear, human, and her mind could come up with nothing, but just simply blank. Nothing had matched the sound she was hearing. Still, they tried to dismiss them as coyotes and simply went to bed. But it was like something that was making the initial sound and the coyotes were answering. But then, later in 2003, another type of sound in this area made her blood turn to ice water. It was August, about 11:30 at night at Peterson, and Vanessa and her husband wanted the luxury of camping at a site instead of dispersed where there was running water and outhouses. They were dousing the fire and about to head into the tent. This is when, from the north, about a half to quarter of a mile away, it seemed there began a howl. Now, it was not a wolf or a coyote howl, but it almost reminded Vanessa of those emergency sirens in rural towns. The pitch was relatively low, and then raised to a higher pitch and was held there for about 6 to 10 seconds, but was still very low in pitch altogether. She thought about Pavarotti and some of the very skilled baritones that she had heard in concert. Vanessa then came to a sickeningly horrifying conclusion that in all the years of voice that she'd studied and heard, not one human had ever uttered something at this pitch, nor could they do it at this volume. The lungs of whatever was doing this had to be massive, and as in the forest, it echoed a lot, but it was not the echoes that made it sound strange. Vanessa just looks at her husband, who was also clearly startled, looking at her, and then they looked at some of the other campers across from the scrub from them. They had stood up and were motionless, looking back at them, then looking in the direction it was coming from, and Vanessa asks, "What is that?" But her husband said he didn't know. They remained standing, and it continued on for about 2 minutes, then ceasing. They had never heard anything like that in all the years they have camped and caved in the area. No human lungs were capable of that kind of power. And Vanessa has always been a die-hard tenter backpacker, but that night, she could not sleep in the tent. She was simply too frightened by the realization that what she had heard was impossible. No creature existed could make this kind of sound. Unless she remembered that this area had quite a few Bigfoot sightings over the years. She could not accept it, but she could also not sleep in the tent. So they simply got their bags and pads and slept in the truck that night. She barely slept and was very glad to be leaving in the morning. Vanessa was shaken for quite a while. Vanessa and her husband went to the Mount Adams Ranger Station in town that morning on the way out and asked if there were any unusual animal activity the night before. The ranger just looked at Vanessa like she was under the influence. Vanessa never said the words, but she knows that he knew what she was thinking. The ranger, of course, covered her tracks and said she had not heard anything and had no idea what she was talking about. And for Vanessa, sometimes terror and curiosity go hand in hand, because in 2004, they decided to go back to the area, the same one they camped at in Peterson, as there's no way that she can get used to camping this way. So they're there, visiting their favorite caves in the area, and early the last afternoon, her husband and her decide to go cave hunting. And of course, she looks back, wondering what she was thinking, but it was broad daylight, so she just assumed they would be okay. Her and her husband trekked down a side forest road that was so overgrown with vine maple and had significant tree fall at the beginning so that you could not drive it anymore. They bushwhacked through the grown-up vine maple and the remnants of a clear cut and split up and planned to come around to meet each other. As her and her husband knew, this particular forest road curved around a bit, and after a while, she had had enough bushwhacking and decided to just meander down the forest road on some more even terrain. So she headed toward the mountain on this road with her husband. Off in the deep bush to her left, she noticed how warm it was, and that it was uncomfortably hot and still. Nothing but the sound of her boots crunching on the packed gravel. And then, she had heard the gravel move behind her, probably about 20 yards, and she took her time turning around, thinking that it was perhaps a cow because this was an open range area, and as weird as it seems to see cows in the forest in clear-cut, it's not exactly uncommon, but whatever it was had a very heavy sound. And then she felt faint, like she was going blind and seeing colors and shot up with some hallucinogen all at once. And she watched as a huge, dark-haired, cinnamon-colored human-like thing clear the ditch in one stride, gliding into the tree line in one more lightning step, and then stood absolutely still. And there Vanessa was, all by herself, in the middle of this isolated forest road with this hairy humanoid-like creature, a cinnamon-colored shoulder and arm unhidden behind a tree. The shoulder was massive, as was the arm, and so long that it was almost as tall as she was. If she looks, for example, at the door jamb in her office, she'd put the shoulder's height at just under the bottom of the post. She could even see the contour of the muscles under the hair and fur. It was obviously a powerful animal. The hair and fur appeared to be about 3 inches long, and she couldn't see the entire hand as it was blocked by some undergrowth. And there it was, just standing stock still, watching Vanessa. Did it think it was entirely hidden? Vanessa had heard about people being paralyzed with fear and could never imagine that, but that's precisely what was happening. She thought she was going to die very soon. and she really had no idea what was going to happen. She was utterly frozen in fear and defenseless. She wanted to move, but she could not. She thought it might chase her if she ran. She could not turn her back on it. And at some point, survival mode had kicked in all the way because she remembers her training about bears, and she began to back away very slowly, spoke very quietly, and was even tempted to leave her pack. It still did not move and stayed there, still as stone. She must have backed down that gravel about 100 yards, and since there was no movement still, she had decided to risk it and yell for her partner. There was no other way out of there. And she yelled for help at the top of her lungs, and her husband finally answered, "Where are you?" And she somewhat meekly called back, "Here," afraid that her shouting might have the opposite effect of what she had wanted, and potentially agitating this unknown creature. A few minutes later, her husband comes crashing through the underbrush, panicked on his face, and he asks what was wrong. And so Vanessa just tells him that a bear, who looked disgusting and angry, had tried to attack her, and he asked her where it was, and so Vanessa had pointed up there, and that it was now gone. After looking around a bit, Vanessa and her husband did leave from the area. They cut through the vine maple opposite the encounter and hightailed it back to the car. As Vanessa thought about it afterward, she noted that there was no smell during this encounter to warn her, but there was also no wind that afternoon, and it was really hot. It took her 4 years to even tell her husband what she truly saw. And fortunately, she claims her husband is pretty reasonable and believes, with astonishment by the way, what she's recently told him. And in 2009, her and her husband both camped in Peterson Prairie again in August. They had a lot of reservations about camping in a tent there due to the previous encounter in the area, but thought that with all the other campers around, which there was like 6 to 7 sites being occupied, and right next to the obnoxious camp host RV, there wouldn't be a chance of having a sighting. It was raining, which is very unusual for that time of year. In the evening, they pulled into the campground and set up the tent at the site just north of the camp host. They made dinner and called it a night, with it still raining outside. But something had woken up Vanessa at about 2:30 in the morning. It sounded like 2 rocks being knocked together down the primarily dry creek bed south of them. Vanessa was listening for sounds of clothing, car or camper doors, or soft voices, thinking someone was up really late. And after listening intently for about 5 minutes to these sounds of light rain on the tent walls, there were no human sounds or movement nearby. Then the rocks knocked again, just a couple of times. She wanted to wake up her husband to have him hear, but the sleeping bags make so much noise and she couldn't be sure he'd be silent when waking. She was then shocked and terrified by what she had heard next. Something whooshed nearby, and then she hears a thud on the ground. She was astonished. What can be moving so fast through the air that it would make a loud whooshing sound? She listened for any sound of leaf noise in case a tree limb had fallen, but no undergrowth impact noise nor leaf noise, as she has heard before when a limb falls. What could be whooshing so strongly through the air that she hears it and then hears an impact nearby? Something was being thrown or beaten on the ground, and based on her experience in the area, she's pretty sure that it was rocks or pieces of wood. But how big or close does it have to be to where you could actually hear a whoosh? Now that was terrifying. She was literally afraid for her life if one of whatever it was had hit her or hit the tent. And she had listened for footfalls or scrub noise to see if she could tell if something was coming closer. But there were no footfalls, but another whoosh/thud. And now she was out of her mind with fear, thinking they'd be hurt or killed by an impact through the tent. How is it that she didn't hear something close by, either breathing or moving? It must have been from quite a distance, meaning that something big was chucking large objects in the tent's direction from far away. Vanessa, of course, did not sleep the entire night. Her husband woke up around dawn, and there she was, in her sleeping bag, still wide-eyed and terrified. He, of course, asked Vanessa how long that she had been awake, and she told him the entire night. Then she goes on to tell him what she had heard, and he informs her that he'd wished that she had woken him up, and actually really wanted to hear or see one. And then she tells him that she didn't want to risk them becoming a potential target, so she just remains still. As they're both getting older, they now have a micro camper that they're going to start using to camp and boondock with. So a trip down to Skamania or Klickitat County is soon to be on the books. But of course, both those counties in southern Washington are also hotbeds for Bigfoot stories and sightings as well. And of course, while Vanessa's stories and experiences in Washington are pretty hair-raising, they're just one of the thousands that occur in this state of Washington every day. If you guys enjoyed today's video, be sure to go ahead and smack that like button. Also, leave a comment down below. I would love to know what you think of today's stories. And if you're new to the channel, be sure to go ahead and hit the big old red subscribe button, as it greatly helps out my channel. And as always, guys, I love you all. Keep an open mind, and I'll see you guys in the very next video.